Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. You're very welcome to this, our 119th in the series of Signpost webinars. I hope you're well wherever you are. It's a lovely morning here this morning in Wexford. I'm broadcasting from Enniscorthy, so I'm a little bit envious of the people that are out and about in the lovely sunshine. But look, join us for the next hour, and we should have a good session with our guest speakers and on a very interesting topic. The webinar is brought to you by Teagasc in association with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network and Food Drink Ireland. My name is Ger Shortle. I'm the manager of the Wicklow Carlow Wexford Advisory Region. And I'm joined this morning by my colleague, Catherine Keane, who's going to look after the Q&A part of the session. Now, after the presentation by Derek, we'll have a Q&A, and please feel free at any stage to type in your questions there in the Q&A section, the button at the bottom of your screen. Catherine will be keeping an eye on those, and she'll be adding them in at the end of the session in our Q&A session. Our speaker this morning is Derek McLaughlin. He's the project manager on the Wild Atlantic Way. That's an innovative integrated project that's been funded there by the EU LIFE programme. Derek is an ecologist by training, and he's a particular interest in how we interact with nature and how society deals with nature, and the role of results-based payment schemes in helping to implement policy in agri-environmental areas and get the best results we can for the investment we put into them, and involving a broad range of actors, including farmers, the general public, and public bodies, and all with the objective of getting the best result for both agriculture, for society, and for nature. So, Derek, thanks very much for joining us this morning and sharing with us your knowledge on this very interesting project, which is a very large and significant project in the context of managing uplands. By the way, this is part of a series of focus on uplands that we're doing at the moment, and I think this is the third week of a 4-week series. So we hope to explore that topic very fully during that time. So, Derek, without further ado, if you'd like to give us a little bit of a background of how you got to where you are in terms of the path that's taken you to this project and to your current role before you start your presentation.
Well, thanks very much, Ger, and hello everyone, and it looks great to be here speaking today. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm an ecologist by trade. I'm broadcasting here from West County Mayo. I suppose one of the best counties never to have won in All Ireland over the last 70 years. Think about it every morning. But nonetheless, yes, I have a background in ecology, and for the last, I suppose, 20 years or thereabouts, have been involved in agroecology and the ecological aspects of agriculture practice, the development of agri-environment programs with better environmental outcomes, and working, I suppose, to make them as effective for farming and for nature and for biodiversity and so on. Would have worked previously on one of the EIPs, the Pearl Mussel project, and before that would have worked in the development of results-based programs on one or two EU-funded programs, and previous to that, then I would have done a lot of work in consultancy that included a lot of monitoring of the likes of GLAS and EOS and other previous agri-environment programs. So that's where I'm coming from on this.
Thanks very much for that very succinct summary. I'm sure there's a lot more detail, but we haven't time this morning. We need to get straight into the topic of the morning, which is the project you're currently managing and will be for some considerable time into the future. It's a big, long project. So the Wild Atlantic Nature Project, Derek, I'll hand over to you now to present to us on that. And after that, as I say, we'll have Q&A. Catherine, do you want to come in just to explain how the Q&A works there before we start?
No, just encourage people now at any stage during the presentation to put their questions type them into the Q&A. So right. Thanks, Ger.
Okay, Catherine. So Derek, I'll hand over to you now. Thanks very much.
Excellent, Ger. And just to confirm, you can see my presentation slide there.
Yeah,
Mike, can you?
very clear here. Yeah.
Excellent, perfect. Yeah. Look, that's great. And I will, as Ger mentioned, Wild Atlantic Nature Life Integrated Project is a large project, and there's a lot of different wings to it. I'll take some of the aspects. I'll try to give a big oversight picture of it, but we'll particularly focus more on the agriculture side of the house today. It's, as Ger mentioned, it's an EU funded project and under the LIFE program, and LIFE is a funding stream that assists member states in meeting their various objectives, various regulatory objectives, European regulatory objectives. And in this instance, we're looking at nature, particularly climate and water. So it's under the prioritized action framework, which is something that a lot of people don't need to know what it is, but it's relates to all aspects of biodiversity and so on. So it's a basic budget of 20 million across 9 years that will run to about 2029 or thereabouts. And I'll talk about the budget maybe later on and some of the very interesting aspects to that. It's particularly aimed at the Natura 2000 network, but you'll see as I go on that the remit is actually is broader than that. It's policy and it's connections between these sites, and ultimately it means that we have some sort of remit with all biodiversity, water quality, climate, and so on, and a really, really big focus, like naturally enough. And obviously, I would say that the quality of the lands that we're dealing with reflect the types of land use that are there, and they reflect the intensity or the type of farming that's done there. So like our key focus are farmers for an awful lot of our areas, and other landowners as well, including some of our partners, including the likes of Quilcha and so on. So it's an expansive area where particularly we're focused in the northwest as it stands. Our sites run across Blanket Bog, SACs from their special areas of conservation, from the Schlivachties right through Connemara, through North Mayo, into the Ox Mountains, Sligo, Leitrim, and up to North Donegal. So it covers an area of over 250,000 hectares of blanket bogs. Blanket bogs are a particular point of interest to us in the project as well, and for many reasons that I'll just discuss shortly. Actually very shortly, right away in fact, because blanket bogs, again, from a European context, Ireland has well over 85% of the EU's blanket bog resource, and blanket bogs are generally deep peat areas. The vegetation typically dies off, and because of the high levels of rainfall in these areas, it accumulates at a rate of about 1 millimeter per year. But that in itself forms carbon, forms turf, forms bog, and obviously from living in a world that we do with the climate issues that we're dealing with, that's obviously very, very significant. And you can some of these kind of maybe pub statistics or pop statistics of the peatlands cover only 3% of the world's land surface, but store more carbon than all of the other vegetation types combined is pretty significant as well. Indeed, and indeed, the top 6 inches, the top 150 millimeters of a blanket bog contain more carbon per hectare than a tropical rainforest. And in fact, because the bogs grow, at this, say, 1 millimeter thereabouts a year, it's constantly sequestering carbon. So it's taking in carbon from the atmosphere. Now that's provided that they are intact and provided that they're one full hydrological unit, an intact unit. So they take carbon in, they're either neutral or you take it up to about 1/4 of a ton per hectare per year, indefinitely, which is really, really, really important. Of course, the converse happens as well, that when you drain bogs, it loses it at a massive rate. You could be talking a heavily drained bog could lose 4, 5, 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So that's a really big focus from a biodiversity perspective, and from a carbon perspective, and from a water quality perspective as well. And of course, there are a lot of threats to our blanket bogs because of our primarily our varying policy objectives as a state over the last state, and actually globally over the last number of decades, particularly. And in terms of a key remit that we have of trying to improve the quality of blanket bogs, and again, we can't look at blanket bogs as a single entity by any means, because blanket bogs and the quality of those, they depend on, from a farming perspective, they depend on adjacent grasslands to manage stock, to manage potentially the blanket bogs and heaths and so on. So really, when we're looking at conserving, and when we're looking at improving the quality of our blanket bogs, it actually includes everything really in these areas. But when one looks at the barriers to the actual protection of these, the institutional barriers are a massive aspect to this, because very often farmers are extremely adaptable to the types of policies that are presented on the table. They're obviously, farmers are probably amongst the most innovative in our society, actually, and need to be. But as policies change over the years, farmers adapt to that, and they do it very well. But of course, our policies, up to now have sometimes been quite disjunct, in that some policies have given rise to will incentivize certain type of actions, and other policies, perhaps agriculture, pulling in one direction, maybe climate, maybe water or biodiversity pulling in a slightly different one. And ultimately, the end result of disjunct or misaligned policies is damage on the ground. One often thinks about, well, draining a bog or whatever is the damage, but very often that's obviously the symptom. But what are the causes of that? And it's often a response to policy messages. So that's something that in our minds, in addressing this, is something we've put a lot of effort into. And we know that the evidence is there over the last 30 years, for example, that we know that our water quality, there's more than a 10-fold decline in the number of pristine water bodies that are generally associated with these types of areas, these blanket bog areas. We know that 85% of our habitats in these areas are in bad or inadequate status, and we know what's happening from a climate perspective. But we also know that the European Court of Auditors have been very clear that from the European perspective, that CAP hasn't been necessarily delivering for biodiversity. And that's something that really raises a lot of question marks, in terms of, we need to be very careful that we're spending money well, and as well as we can do, and make it work for the farmer, make it work for the environment, and so on. And I think, just to conclude maybe on the policy side of things, over the past 50, 60, 70 years, depending on where our economy is, and depending on what our own knowledge is, we had different focuses of our land use. So we saw blanket bogs as a great place to plant conifers, and we now know that that's not a good idea. We often, see, from a flood mitigation perspective, we sometimes see, again, the symptoms, and remove what may well be natural flood defense mechanisms for further down. We often think that, well, build a dike and that will deal with it, or the likes. May be appropriate in some areas, but in others it very often isn't. And indeed, focusing solely on nature as well isn't necessarily just a positive thing. We need to consider all of the aspects on a landscape level. But we have learned a lot of really valuable lessons over the last 30 years, I think, with some of the programs, particularly coming from the likes of the Burren program, and other programs in other disciplines and in other sectors of society. We know that successful programs, particularly agri-environment programs, need to be locally adapted. They need to be practical, and they need to be results focused as well. They need to be developed with local people. They can't be developed from an office here in West Mayo or an office down in Enniscorthy or wherever. You know, they need to be relevant and related and relatable to those areas within which they're going to be developed and implemented. They need to be fairly funded and properly funded, and they need to be flexible and permit this adaptive management as well. And that's something that's massively important, because we all do things differently. We all do things differently, and who gives two hoots how you get to Dublin, provided you get to Dublin. It doesn't matter whether you go via Mullingar or Athlone or wherever. And in this instance, if we're looking for a good ecological output, it doesn't matter how one reaches that. So by putting in and sometimes barriers can be needing to be a certain specification or whatever, regardless of the outcomes. That's what I mean by allowing and facilitating flexible management and being results focused. Local trust and capacity is something very important as well. And trust is an absolute obvious one. By capacity, the ability to be able to understand the scheme, say a farmer is in, or that a landowner is in, the capacity of advisors, the capacity of Department of Agriculture, of the likes of National Parks and Wildlife Service, of ourselves in understanding how these programs need to work. And facilitating improvement is massively important. And it's something that it's basic economics to a lot of extent. If you produce better goods, you should be rewarded more, and that's fairly obvious. And similarly, on the ground, if a farmer or a landowner is has delivered everything that we need, or really high quality ecological outputs, they should be rewarded higher than someone that has lower ecological outputs. Those perhaps with lower ecological outputs are earning their money through some other enterprise, or maybe a higher investment in another aspect of their enterprise. And then accounting for factors outside of farmers' control is something that's very important. You'll have heard of this over previous Signpost series, the idea of the results-based payments, that essentially a scored payment, the higher the score, the higher the payment. The higher the score, the higher the ecological value, or the higher the ecological value, the higher the score, and then the higher the payment. But of course, in what we need to do is that we need to ensure that we're not just jumping on a train of climate, or just of biodiversity, or just of water quality, and then in 7 years' time it's something else. It needs to be a completely coherent and integrated approach, so that we know that that if something good has been delivered for biodiversity, for water quality, for all of the services, the so-called environmental services that we need to be delivered. So obviously the trick in a lot of this is rewarding the high quality, but also ensuring that you can incentivize the improvement of the poorer quality as well, so that you're not excluding, you're not putting perverse, by only targeting the poor quality, you're potentially putting in perverse incentives to disimproving your high quality. So just ensuring that it's considered across those. And a very good way, in a way that we in Wild Atlantic Nature, that we're building on these the experience of the likes of the Pearl Mussel project and the Hen Harrier project EIPs, and several other EIPs that have developed this model. And I'll talk about where it's going in a second, but ultimately this is all underpinned through these scorecards that make a lot of sense to farmers on the ground. They're simple to use, but they're really powerful in terms of describing what's on the ground, but also providing management guidance there. So these are your score. They will give rise to your farmer's payment. They will be the management plan for that area or that plot as well. Because of course, if you've got, for example, rhododendron in your peatland, it will reduce your score. So the obvious management recommendation there is to, well, remove or control rhododendron. If your peatland is extensively drained, you will have much lower scores there, or very little score from that. And the obvious one is to go and look at restoring those peatlands. So it acts as a very, very powerful tool there as well, with proper guidance. And we use the payment levels on the left as a little graph that we don't pay on something less than a 4. And the idea there is that if it's not delivering, it's not something that we can pay on. But it provides that opportunity to invest in one's environmental and ecological quality, and get a better reward and return for that. But it leaves the flexibility to be involved or not as well, and to invest to whatever extent one works best for that enterprise. So I think that's important. Again, we have 2 payment streams, and it's the results-based payment. What does a farmer have to do for that? They don't have to do anything for that. That's what their historical management has given rise to. That's the quality of the land as it stands. And that has the effect of aligning these policies. I showed the tug-of-war cartoon earlier on, but that gives us rise to this alignment of the policies, in that we as kind of taxpayers, consider what is wanted, and it's very, very clear message from there. But vital to all of this is that it's not just that, because then that could potentially lock in farmers to a low score or whatever. But you need these what we call supporting actions payments, or non-productive investment payments. These are those potentially payments and advice and so on, and support to be able to improve your quality on the ground. And in the peatland, in a broader water quality context, it may well be kind of sediment sluices, or it may be peatland restoration, it may be assistance to move away from turf cutting, it may be assistance to alter stock management, where maybe it was just become specialized just sheep, when in reality a mix would probably be a better ecological outcome of mix of cattle and sheep and so on. So these are all typical supporting actions there. They could be bridges, they could be fences, gates, etc. It doesn't matter what, as I say, if the result is being delivered, this is the tool to achieve that. And of course, what this does is that this creates a market for these ecosystem services. Ultimately, we all know that if you bring a better animal to the market, you'll get a better price than you would if you brought a poor animal to the market. And it's the same idea here, is that if you've got a better output of biodiversity, of better quality water, better quality carbon sequestration or carbon storage, that ought to attract better payments and so on, all the time. And this is a really important aspect, but all of the time, providing and ensuring that the support is there to be able to improve, and that's what's really, really important. So just a brief step back from what I've just been talking about there, in terms of the overall wild Atlantic nature approach towards blanket bogs and Natura 2000 and broader biodiversity and climate and so on. We have, the project is in 3 pillars as such. We look at the center one as such, which is the capacity building, and that's something I mentioned. And that's where our results-based approach fits in. It's this idea of building capacity amongst farmers and advisors and the general public, Department of Agriculture, National Parks and Wildlife Service, other government departments and so on, all of society. So that's done through our results-based program, our knowledge exchange programs, our site surveys, our training. We do fairly extensive training programs and so on as well for farmers, advisors and others, community groups and so on. Then there's education and awareness on the back of this. This is the likes of schools programs that we're working with the Heritage Council, one of our 10 project partners, and they've developed a schools program on this. Through we are delivering the likes of the tourism infrastructure indeed as well, the likes of boardwalks in appropriate places, and so on, in building awareness and so on of peatlands. And of course then we've got the land and ecosystem management, the these are what one would typically do, what actions one would do to improve ecological restoration through invasives removal, through peatland restoration. Maybe it could be drain blocking, it could be fencing, it could be removal of fences, it could be a lot of different different things, stock management, etc. But this is how the overall project looks, but it's all being implemented through the same ethos of the results-based approach of valuing higher quality on that. So in terms of our work to date, we're only in the door about since the beginning of 2021, and last year we had 170 farmers, 167 farmers across 20,000 hectares in County Mayo, with 26 advisors trained, and about 18 of those were working actively on the project. In 2022 now we've got 750 farmers in, and their lands are being scored as we speak. So a big aspect of that is building capacity for the new acres program. So all in all, there'll be nearly 3 million will be paid out to farmers across these 2 years, over a relatively extensive area of the Northwest, and that's part of that process of establishing the approach of training, of understanding the results-based approach, understanding the quality aspect to it, and the improvement of quality on the ground. So in terms of where it goes next, you'll be familiar likely with the acres approach and the cooperation project, or acres rather, and the cooperation project approach that will be running from 2023, from January 2023. There are currently 8 cooperation project teams in place across these. You can see on throughout the country there, from Donegal down through the country and so on. And the idea there is that they will be using a very, very similar model to the one I've just described, where the basic payments will be the not the BPS. I will just clarify that. It's the ACM, so it's their agri-environment. It's a new gloss as such. Will be relating to the results-based payments, but there will be non-productive investment payments for what we call supporting actions and landscape actions to assist in the improvement of quality on the ground. So that's, the finer details being prepared and so on. I think it'll be all happening on the ground very, very soon, but ultimately there is a mechanism by which conservation and actions and restoration actions can be implemented. And that's really, really important. From now on in these areas, it will make sense to improve your ecological quality. It doesn't mean that every farmer will or will want to, but what it does is that for the first time, it makes sense to do that. And that aligns a lot of the policies. So that's really positive. I see the last sentence there. It says, wild Atlantic nature will provide support, and it's like something from the life of Brian. And that's what everyone hinges on, is the and that I didn't include. Ultimately, from 2023, we won't be delivering a results-based program as we have been for last year and this year, but we will build on top of those cooperation projects. And that's a really exciting aspect there as well. So from January 2023, another one of our 10 partners is Teagasc ourselves. Ger and Catherine Keane is working very closely with us on this in the development of an upland farmers knowledge exchange group. And that's really exciting. That's something that's ongoing, that has been up and running for the last number of months in County Mayo, and that will be rolled out, this pilot. So that's really exciting. The overall project itself will be there to focus on larger restoration projects, those that will be maybe complex because they're maybe commonage, or complex because they're large areas of conifer plantations or whatever. So we're there to assist with, I suppose, a lot of the red tape for a start, but the expertise and funding as well. And indeed, from a funding perspective, the idea of we're demonstrating the the ability to take in money from elsewhere. We're a life integrated project, so that means that we have a remit to seek complementary funding that I'll talk about in 1 minute. So I suppose just to stand back again from a broader perspective, we now have on a landscape scale, I think from from this point on, we have a quality based payment system, and that quality becomes the platform, and that's really strong from the perspective of being able to demonstrate. And we need to do further work on this. We need to do a lot of work in some areas in terms of ensuring that whatever the score is and so on reflects the carbon deliverables or the water quality, the biodiversity deliverables on those. But ultimately, quality becomes the key platform. So we're not going out looking for where are the damaged areas and how do we fix them. We're saying that we're valuing quality. If there's high quality, we value that. If there's low quality, we assist in the improvements of that. So that'll be the basis for farmer payments across 20,000 farmers in acres. For land use planning, I see that something that can be really, really important, because if farmers are doing it, then managing authorities in their various areas need to be doing that as well. Indeed, from a tourism perspective, the idea of the scorecards are a very really engaging way to actually understand a landscape. From a food labeling perspective as well, the idea that lands that have a higher ecological output, be it kind of like an 8E rating on a packaging or so on, is very, very strong. And that adds value to that end product as well. And again, that forms that cycle of valuing the higher ecological quality. And indeed, the idea of marketing Natura, this Natura 2000, which is the network of SACs and SPAs that has been I suppose slapped down on some people's lands and so on, and it has been very controversial, but that can be something that could be hugely positive, and ought to be, and can be, I believe. And then just to come into the end now, Ger, but just I mentioned the fact that this is a life IP, which is an integrated project, so it's slightly different from your traditional life projects in that we have a basic fund of 20 million across a whole range of nearly 100 actions or so within the project, and that's across 10 different project partners. And the complementary funding aspect of that is we know that as we go along, that lots of other opportunities will arise, and we have the remit of actually seeking complementary funding, and that can be from any source, obviously any legal source, but typically it could be European funded, it could be philanthropy, it could be corporate investment, it could be any aspect here as well, because we've got a very, very strong model here where we can demonstrate deliverables. We've got a very large number of landowners and stakeholders within the overall program, and that's something that's very strong from a funder's perspective. Classic examples would be a rhododendron community led rhododendron control project in Delphi in South Mayo that were that has worked extremely well, and that's one where rather than getting contractors to go in and just clear rhododendron and then be gone out of sight, that the local community and local farmers there have been trained, and those that are available or that are interested have been trained and now are a real expert in the whole process, from the mapping through the prioritization of where controls to be done, and then the actual physical work in itself. And that means that resource will always be there, that capacity will always be there, and that understanding of the management of those areas. So that's something that's really important. Waterlands is another good example. It's a Horizon 2020 funded project of about 2 million that we're a partner on with a much larger consortium coordinated by UCD, and that's in Culcairn on the Cavan-Leitrim border. And then there's a whole range of other projects that we're involved in. We're either co-funding or we've sought funding from elsewhere. And one really nice example is with the Hare's Corner with Burren Bio, and that was a very successful program that ran last year in the Burren. And we're this year going to, in 2023, we're going to pilot it in County Mayo, and then with the view to further rollout of that. So we're a very good kind of practice partner or springboard for these larger projects, and so on. And then just to summarize, I suppose that it's a very broad-ranging project and so on, but ultimately the whole idea is the idea of integrating the various different policies that are at play here, the policies that practice and so on, with the key thing being focus on the quality. It's not let's go and find where the damage is necessarily. That's part of it, but it's focusing on the quality. We see the world in 3D, and we will see the world in 3D rather than actually that's a mountain or it's not a mountain. Results-based model that invests in landowner skills is obviously core to this, and again, the overall model of Wild Atlantic Nature is a very strong opportunity to assist with local issues, local opportunities, be that on a commonage basis or community groups, and so on. We've got a website there as well, wildatlanticnature.ie, and just finally, just to thank Catherine and all of you for listening here as well. And you'll see that the range of project partners there as well across the board. So look, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Derek. If you could just stop sharing the screen there, thank you very much. Look, I think in the time allotted there, you've managed to do a very, very good job on getting across a very good sense of what is a really significant and very large project with a very broad remit. I think it's it's very comprehensive. It covers, I think, in its approach, both in terms of inclusion of different groups and also the aims and objectives are extremely broad and seem to be very comprehensive. And so fair play to you for keeping your head around all that, and for the people who put this project together. It's an amazing achievement. Look, I suppose there's 1,000 questions we could ask about this, but I suppose I'm coming at it from the point of view of where the rubber hits the road with us in terms of dealing with farmers. How important, or is it vitally important, or is there some flexibility around, say, grazing management and grazing pressure and livestock on the blanket peats? Do livestock, are they vital, or can you have some flexibility in terms of grazing pressures, or is very specific management required to get an improvement in your score on these type of areas?
It's a good question, Ger, and it's a complex answer as always. If there's very poor vegetation, clearly any grazing is a problem. If there's a lot of bare peat, any grazing is a problem. In many areas and in many commonages, one contiguous unit, you'll often find that some of it may be overgrazed, maybe very heavily grazed, maybe bare peat and so on. Other areas may be the sheep may never go into. And that in itself is an indication of I suppose maybe I'd say incorrect stock management, in that a lot of suckler herds went west altogether in the west here, and we most farms are only sheep. The mix at the time of sheep and cattle was very good, because the cattle would forage in areas that the sheep wouldn't, and would open those areas to some extent to sheep. So you've got lower intensity across a broader area. So that's a broader stock management. I will say that in deep peats, very often little or no grazing is. They are kind of a climax vegetation that do very well by themselves. I think in outside of the deep peats, most areas do need an element of a strong element of grazing management, I would say as well. Now, and of course as well, I'm conscious that that we have a lot of focus on heaths that would be upland areas that would traditionally have been grazed, and if they weren't grazed, we'll go back to woodland and so on. So that there's a complexity about the whole lot as to what the original, or what the ideal climax habitat types would be. But generally, you find that low intensity diversity between grazing and broader management is something that's very, very important.
Right, so it looks like, I mean, there's a big need there to tease out these issues with the landowners and the farmers who are managing this area, because there isn't a simple solution. It's a complex solution. I suppose that's the challenge, to try and get people's heads around what the what the different management practices which ones are needed in certain places and so on.
Yeah, I would say that very often on a site-by-site basis, as you know well, some things will be appropriate and other things won't. And nearly every place, nearly every farmer I talk to would actually know the answers as to what it would be most appropriate when you tease down through it. But very often, we've gone down the road of specializing, specializing in just sheep, and that's their broader policy, I suppose, decisions that have been made and so on. And I suppose to a very good extent, when you specialize, you put more eggs in one basket, and I would say diversifying it is probably the, ecologically and economically is probably the most safe bet, I would say.
Well, it's interesting that the cattle may be part of the solution, which they're being pilloried as they call it, the source of all the environmental problems. But in this case, they may well be part of the solution.
Yeah, and indeed, I will say that, talk of, without going down the rabbit hole of the national herd and so on, what does worry me an awful lot is that in some areas they're an absolute vital tool, and if you suddenly had the wrong farmers losing stock or a further incentive in some areas, it would be an even bigger swing, and it could potentially have negative output. So it's nuanced, and one needs to be very careful as to what our objectives are on a kind of a landscape basis.
Thanks very much. Look, I won't hog all the questions. There's lots of questions have come in there, and I think, Catherine, I'll hand over to you to maybe start the ball rolling there with some of those questions. Back to Derek.
Thanks, Ger. And yeah, there's a huge number of questions, and there's a large audience joined us. And before I go to you, Derek, I'll just clarify a couple of things that are easy for me to explain. First of all, this presentation and the others will be available. Both the PowerPoints and the recordings will be available on the Teagasc website. And again, just to reiterate that this is one of 4 upland presentations. So people joining in today may be interested in the previous 2, which was Katrina Douglas from the NPWS, and our Teagasc advisor Katrina Foley, and Owen Carton, project manager of Cumra Uplands Communities. And next week we will have Killian Kelly from Munster Technological University talking about conservation grazing and the cattle there that you just mentioned. So they will all be available. That was one question. Another question was, what is APERS? So I can possibly explain that one. That is the new agri-environmental scheme that will be around from the next 5 years. Advisors are just getting ready to draw up the plans for that. So that will be the replacement for what was GLAS and would have been EOS and REPS in the past. And there was a query about where organic fits in. So Derek may or may not wish to go into that, but just to explain that the organic scheme fits alongside all of these other schemes. Farmers can never be double paid for the same action, but for a farmer in any agri-environment scheme or the Wild Atlantic Nature may also be in organic and get further payments for the organic side of it. So then just to go back to, we've lots of good questions. So Derek, are you ready? In terms of practical implementation on the ground, differences between LIFE and EIP projects, are there pros and cons?
So very briefly, EIP and LIFE are 2 different, obviously, funding streams. European Innovation Partnerships are the EIPs, come from the Rural Development Programme, so they're CAP funded, and they're tend to be innovative projects, and they do have certain rules, but they are relatively flexible. And I think I must commend the Department of Agriculture on their on rolling out the IPs over the last 5 years or so, and they really have added massively to the approach. And I think they're the envy of Europe from that perspective. So they're very good from the perspective of flexibility, of having a good focus, and so on. LIFE is, and I will say the percentage of funding is usually a large proportion of what's required in terms of the IPs, or else it's funded outright. With the life, it's usually, there's a number of funding streams funded at 60 and 75%. They tend to be really focused, depending on the live stream and nature and so on. They tend to be focused on Natura 2000 areas and so on. It really depends on who one's partners are, and the organizational setup. For state actors primarily, life is is the one to go for maybe community groups and so on, I would say, or was the mix that maybe EIPs. There's also Horizon 2020, and there's a lot of other funding sources there as well that can be considered too.
Thank you, Derek. Farmer's daughter living in rural Sligo is questioning the community side. I'm hearing the word farmer a lot, and I know that bogland is largely owned by farmers. However, I would like to know if there are community-based payment schemes. And the reason she asks is there's more, her opinion is there is more chance of a successful outcome if results are rewarded at community level. And there's a risk of isolating farming groups from community groups if farmers are seen to be getting paid again by the EU.
Well, I would say farmers are part of the community, and so on. But I do definitely get the point. All right, that what about the non-farming landowners within the community? And indeed, we have community groups that have land that we're assisting with on this. I should make the point that in our first 2 years, because you're talking about the biggest funder of biodiversity and climate and so on in an Irish context and in a European context is the Common Agricultural Policy. So our effort was to try and get as best an outcome and assist rather with getting as good an outcome as possible with this CAP. That's starting in January 2023. So a big focus was on the design of that. But absolutely, we are very much, the Hare's Corner, for example, is one where we, with the Burren Bio Trust, we have a small grant for the planting of trees and other ecological restoration actions. We hoped to have opportunities for communities, and I would encourage them to actually get in touch with us in 2023 or thereabouts, that we will hopefully be able to focus on assisting with the funding applications for restoration actions in these areas as well. So I like, from an integration perspective, it's all land. It shouldn't really matter about the land ownership, who owns it necessarily, but rather that it's functioning well, or that we consider
and who's doing the work, kind of, who's helping.
Yeah, exactly.
The result, isn't it, Derek? Yeah. And again, your life IP is a good example of that. Just moving on to another one. Is there, I suppose the bottom line is there help for farmers? Is there expert operators to help restoration works?
Yeah, and again, it's something that we're building. It's the capacity thing, because we can't underestimate that you can't bring a whole new system, like within acres, the new GLAS or the new REPS in 2023 and expect everything to just work perfectly. It will take quite a while for relevant experts, for plant hire contractors to become skilled, and now there are some very good plant hire and operatives and experts in these areas that have worked with the existing projects and outside of those. But something that we're working on with Bord na Móna and some other partners as well is training programs for contractors. We've in-house expertise ourselves as well, but very much our big focus is actually ideally that the farmers would do it themselves. They will go through a training program, and then they will understand how to do the drain blocking, if it's drain blocking, or the rhododendron removal, or whatever management needs be, because then they have that capacity, and that's where the gold dust is, really, is that ability, if someone's willing to, and if not, then there are others available.
What positive change can you see emerging at this early stage on the landscape level?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind there is the talk on the ground, and the rumors that someone's hill has scored very high or very low, and that is, I think that's a huge change. That means that farmers and others are rubbernecking into their neighbours' fields, and they're doing an ecological assessment, and they're given a score out of 10, and that score out of 10 is based on the quality. So that means that there's in that relatively short period of time, there's a very strong understanding of what gives rise to a high score or a low score. And if you know that, well, then you know what would need to be done to improve that. Like historically, you're thinking, you look into Rushy Field or you look into bogland and you're thinking, well, I'll lob a drain down here, I'll catch the drain down the bottom. So it suddenly opens that door. So in the short term, I think that's a really strong aspect to it.
And maybe following on for that, Derek, kind of a hard question, because while the Wild Atlantic Nature payments were on top of the GLAS agri-environment payments, the future results-based payments in acres will be the only show in town. So I suppose for that, when, as you're describing, when you're looking over the fence and seeing a field or a farm or an upland that's scoring 0, how do we, that's the tough one for the future, isn't it? If it is in poor condition, no money at all, how do we get improvement?
I think that's where the flexibility in the schemes are very, very important. I think that's where, and that's the whole idea of the cooperation project teams. So I should say in acres, I showed 6 or 8 areas, each will have a project team that will cover that. And within the new CAP, those low scoring areas will clearly need assistance. Sometimes it'll be something that's, relatively straightforward to put in place. It might be stock management, or it might be, whatever kind of infrastructure that is needed, and there is funding available through that on top of their existing payments. And in complex ones, it's someone like ourselves in Wild Atlantic Nature that would and possibly be in a good place to assist from a big restoration project, be that complex because there's a lot of shareholders, or just costing a lot of money, or very expensive. I would say in the instance of commonages, the first thing a commonage shareholder will say, well, what if it's the big guy that doesn't want to do anything, and he says no. In my experience of working with a good few commonages, like generally, if things make sense on the ground, even if someone doesn't like someone else, they'll let it happen rather than object it. Of course, there will be some instances where nothing can be done because there's no agreement or there's complete disagreement. So that's always a possibility as well. But I mean, generally, from the broader side of things, when we consider where we're coming from, the fact that there was no opportunity or no impetus necessarily to improve the quality on the ground is pretty significant. And to consider that maybe previous payments were assuming 100% quality on the ground perhaps, and then penalties took away from that, whereas in this instance one starts with a blank sheet and adds to it depending on their scores.
Very good. So there will be help, and there will be money, more importantly, available to
money and advice, and
yeah,
very often the advice is the massive thing. I mean, the principle of the money, and I know nearly every farmer will say it's all about the money, but it's actually, I know well that from a farmer's perspective, as Brenton Dunford in the Burn would say, it's the pocket, but it's the head and it's the heart as well, and they're all very important factors.
How do you see the results-based payments for carbon sequestration coming online? I see Wild Atlantic Nature and other projects preparing people and the natural capital for this future. But payments of the carbon sequestration is how do you see that coming?
Well, what we've tried to do with the scorecards is that, and again with Wild Atlantic Nature scorecards, we're just building on, like ours are very, very similar to the pearl mussel and hen harrier and so on. But what we've tried to do is that we've used kind of basic surrogates of peatland quality that relate very closely to the plus or the minus in terms of greenhouse gases, the loss or the gain of those. So the cover of sphagnum mosses, for example, or the cover of bare peat on the negative side. We need to do more work on that, but I would see that I would see that whatever way we go in future, that it really ought to be one integrated program, so that your 10 out of 10 for biodiversity is your 10 out of 10 for carbon. We do know that our higher scores, their highest scores are the highest scores for carbon. And we know that the middle scores are the middle scores for carbon, and so on with the lower scores. But we do need to refine that, and we do need to do work. And we will have an extensive, and we're establishing an extensive greenhouse gas monitoring program within the project as well, to relate our scores on the ground to an emissions factor.
Okay, Ger, I know we're coming close. Can I just do a few more comments?
Maybe one or two quick ones.
Yeah, one or two quick ones and a quick answer, Eric. The advisors that are trained, the questioners, are they working with, just explain the structure of the Teagasc private advisors. Are they working for you? How they work for you?
Well, they're working for they're ultimately working. They're nominated by their clients. So that ideally, what we wanted to do in year 1 and 2, these 2 years, is that we wanted the maximum impact in terms of training and upskilling of advisors and farmers. So farmers nominated their own advisors. Advisors went through a training process as well, and they did an assessment at the end of the passed or they failed, and then they're paid by the project on behalf of their farmer, and they're private and Teagasc, so that they're whatever the farmers' advisors were.
Yeah, and excluding those, then a question there: approximately how many people are working on the project?
Well, there's 5 core staff plus another. There's 7 core staff plus another 5 contractors.
And a quick comment on the input of the farmers' own knowledge of their land. How significant a role has this with land management decisions? Indigenous knowledge, the importance of it?
Vital. I would say that I go to a common age group, and I've been working as an ecologist for years and years and years, but the first thing to do is to listen to the setup. It's a different language, there's no doubt about it, but very often never far away from what the solutions are. You know, if there's a problem with overgrazing or undergrazing or whatever it might be, it's I find that there aren't massive bridges to cross. It is a different language, there's no doubt about it, and I think that's the communications is vital. Okay,
Ger.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine and Derek, for handling all those questions. I think there was lots of interest and a broad range of questions, and I hope we got to answer all the most of them anyway. Look, all remains for me to say is thanks very much to Derek for doing a really good job in that presentation. It was really excellent, and for fielding those questions so expertly. And you know, obviously we're at the beginning of something here. There's a lot more to be learned right across the board from all the players in this. But I think it's in good hands, and it has great promise. Just like finally to say thanks to Catherine Keena for helping out with the questions and so well, and for Yvonne Maher behind the scenes, who's basically kept the show on the road and produced this morning's webinar. That concludes today's webinar, but there is one more webinar in this series on the focus on uplands, which is next week, and the concluding one will be a lecture or a talk given by Killian Kelly, who's a lecturer down in Munster Technological University, and that'll be on conservation, grazing and uplands, and as Catherine said, featuring some more extra information on the role of cattle in that, which I think is very significant for many farmers. So that's about it. I'd like to wrap up there, just to add that today's presentation and the entire webinar is available on the Teagasc website, as are the others in the series on the uplands. So if you want to just go and review or see for the first time some of those, you're very welcome to do so. That concludes today's webinar, and I'd like to say thanks to everybody for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the good weather we're having. At least we're having good weather down here, and I hope it's right across the country. And all it remains for me to say is goodbye and thanks to everybody. Thank you.